untrained eye, but
Yes.
one item. Okay,
I
so.
was confused.
One item with two parts.
Right. Okay, item 1701, zoning for residential scaled office uses.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me back there? So this is, y'all have seen a couple times before. We've been talking about this subject of residential scale office, shading into housing opportunities, missing middle housing opportunities. So this is along the lines of what we talked about actually last year, and what we've done since then is done some refinement of some of the options and also incorporated some of the concepts that were included in the historic alley text change, provided some precedent for how we could potentially reconsider transitions between residential districts and mixed-use districts. So I don't have a really lengthy presentation, but a little bit of background and some highlighting of options, and then we could have some discussion. So again, I kind of touched on this, and this was a little bit more for the benefit of the crowd, but talking about
Now, there are people watching on TV.
That's right, and that's a good point. And so one of the original ideas was to think about how we could better facilitate residential scale office uses in certain locations, and more broadly, how we could think about also facilitating additional housing opportunities, missing middle, the idea that there's housing types in between the detached house and a larger multi-story apartment complex that can be a valuable way of providing additional housing choice and additional housing supply in a way that potentially can fit in well with some established residential neighborhoods. So what we had considered specifically originally was the idea of the detached frontage, which exists in the code right now. And as the name suggests, the intent is to apply it to accommodate a mix of uses, but in a way that creates more of a residential scale. The name detached implies that they're detached structures. And that's definitely the overall thought process, but the actual specifics of the detached frontage don't necessarily mandate that there be physical detachment between buildings. So what we had talked about all along was the idea of some additional requirements, additional restrictions on detached frontage that would apply obviously both to existing zones with the detached frontage, but also potentially new application where, and I think where some of these questions really become relevant, making this something, a district of frontage that could really apply in new areas with these additional protections and considerations. So some of the ideas that had been discussed, and I think if this were to move forward, there would probably be some more work during Planning Commission review and looking at the text change and some of the details. But in terms of general outlines, a maximum building size, and we had talked about 8,000 square feet, side yard requirement, which currently with some of the building types in detached frontage, it's not a requirement. So potentially, and again, that gets to the idea of detachment, that it's not necessarily achieved through the detached frontage. Townhouses are certainly permitted and encouraged in that district. But again, in theory, you could have a whole block of townhouses, which may not be bad at all, but if the idea is that there's a detached feel to the district, that would be a little bit counter to that goal. So the idea of a maximum number of townhouses in a row, an example of that would be on St. Mary's, which actually is one of these areas that does have a lot of detached zoning frontage, and I think there's 5 or 6 in a row, and then there's properties on either side. So that's an example of what that could look like. Yes?
The zoning there is
I would have to.
an RX3 or something?
It could be OX. I'd have to check that to be sure.
The question is, does it have the 50 feet or not behind?
Well, I think it's bordered, certainly on St. Mary's by the public street, and on the back side there's some mixed-use zoning. I don't know that it borders a residential district.
Okay, gotcha.
But in thinking about that, what if it were on the other side of St. Mary's? Right. These kind of considerations might really come into play. Thinking about a lower height limit, again, the idea that this would be more aligned with residential district standards. Signs are allowed, ground signs, but perhaps smaller ones, again, same theme. And then limiting uses. So in OX, obviously retail is allowed, and in RX, it's allowed in a corner unit. Thinking about, is that the best fit for this kind of context? So the conversation from that point kind of flowed into the question of, well, if we're thinking about this detached frontage and how it could facilitate these neighborhood scaled office and residential uses, does that in turn, and it comes with extra restrictions to do so, does that in turn mean that perhaps we should rethink the transition that would be required? So a couple more slides about current transition requirements. I'm sure y'all are pretty familiar with this, but for the benefit of any viewers watching this live. So you've got, and this is anytime you have, for the most part, a mixed-use district adjacent to a residential district, with some exceptions that I'll cover. But starting from that line, that district border line, you have a series of transitions. The first 10 feet, at least, is going to be a landscaped area. Moving further from that, you have a 50-foot no-build area where there could not be a primary structure, essentially. And that could be parking, could be additional landscaping, some options there, but essentially not the main building. And then once you get 50 feet away, then the height of the building can be 40 feet at that point. It can get taller, but only at a 45-degree angle. So that's the standard transition between mixed use and residential zoning districts. So there are a couple of exceptions, right, in our code. And the most obvious one is in RX3, the thought process being, well, if you have a 3-story townhouse, like the St. Mary's example that we just talked about, or apartments, perhaps there does not need to be such a separation between that and another residential use. It's the same essential use. So that only requires that first transition area, the 10-foot landscaped yard. Now, more recently, what the city's incorporated is what's called the historic alley transition. So that allows, in other districts, residential uses to come closer as well, under the theory that, again, it's not necessarily such a clash if there are residential uses, and there's some additional conditions on that apply. So that, as the name suggests, historic alley applies only in a couple of certain contexts where you have a National Register district and you have an alley separating the mixed-use area from the residential area. And that was a really good process, I think, came from a lot of work from the residents, and really did a lot of the work advancing that concept themselves. Also, a couple of there's several components of it, but some of the key ones, in addition to only residential uses, also it limits height, kind of as we've discussed. So height could only be what would be allowed in that residential zone, or if there's an overlay district, it would be limited to what the overlay district, if it regulates height, what that sets height at.
And
if there's structured parking, must be screened, and there would have to be alley-facing entrances. Yes?
Can you remind me the width of the alley? Does that factor into any of these distances, or is that not included?
So the alley is part of the transition. So it requires 10 feet, and then you have the alley. So I guess in terms of building to building, it's more like 20-ish. Or if the alley's a couple feet wider, it might be a little bit wider than that.
Okay.
But yeah, the alley actually serves as part of the transition.
Okay,
That's a good question. So I think that leads us to the question today, in addition to thinking about the detached additional restrictions. If a full 50-foot no-build transition isn't always necessary in all contexts, are there some other situations where those transitions could be rethought? And so this is really the last busy slide that I have, just a couple others. And what we've boiled this down to is 3 options. I'll actually start with option 1, and this is the broadest of the 3. It basically just says that whatever the district, OX, NX, any mixed-use district, if the use, because in NX you could do townhouses, or in OX, and in fact, many of the townhouses that we see are being done in those districts. So if that's the case, same use that you could have in RX, 3-story townhouses, if they were done in RX, you would not have that 50-foot separation. If they're done in OX, however, that transition applies. Of course, you could rezone to RX to get out of that transition, but as we all know, that can be a process. So the thought process here is it's really more about the use, right, than the zoning district. So if the use is residential, don't require the 50-foot no-build transition. So in any zoning district, if the use is residential, just reduce that transition to the same that's required in RX3, which is the 10-foot landscaped area. So that's option 1, pretty broad. and doesn't really depend on what, if anything, council chooses to do about the detached frontage. So the second options, they do hinge on that detached frontage and whether or not council would desire to make any changes to that. So one option would be, and we just kind of went through those potential restrictions for detached. So let's say that's what moves forward. Well, given those restrictions, why not reduce the transition to 10 feet in that situation where it's OX? So we're not talking about retail uses. We're talking about basically residential scale buildings in that detached frontage, reduce it just to 10 feet. So a couple of thoughts about that.
No matter what the use is.
Correct. The thought being, so retail's off the table, we're really talking about residential or office. If office comes with that suite of additional restrictions on the building envelope and potentially some other considerations, maybe a reduced justification for a reduced transition would make sense. And could even specifically include some of those elements of the historic alley transition, which provided kind of a template for this. And then the third option is essentially the same as option 2, but adding some additional design standards to that detached frontage. So that early slide, these were more about just the building envelope and then signage. But what could be an additional on top of this element would be some architectural standards to create a more residential appearance. For instance, actually less transparency, requiring some specific architectural features like bay windows. Or you could have a set that generally are found in residential structures rather than office structures. Roof pitch is another one. I mean, sometimes you see some flat roof residential buildings, but that could be one that's typically associated with a residential structure. So to recap, option 1, it's really just about the use. If it's residential, think about reducing that transition. And then the second 2 would be more tied to changes to the detached frontage, whether it's more about the building envelope or whether it's building envelope plus design features. So this is the last slide. Just kind of summarizes those questions. Really, one is, should there be any change to detached frontage? That's kind of really separate from all these other questions. You could answer that, and the others could be no change. But the question 2, then, should there be some adjustment to the transitions? I've laid out those 3 options as starting points. And then question 3 would be, for any of these, would there be a desire for some additional analysis or even outreach? So we do know where, for instance, if we want to explore some of the detached frontage options, we know where there's several dozen properties where you've got a detached frontage zone property next to a residential zone property. So we could reach out to those property owners specifically to get an idea of how they would react to some of those options. And that might give us a sense of how, if there was a desire to apply that more broadly, that might play out. So that's all I have. Questions?
I've got just one admin. Could you go back to the matrix of 3? Okay. Maybe I'm reading this wrong. My option 2 talks about design standards and design and appearance standards. And this one looks like.
Oh, I think
I
think I rearranged those.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, which one? Okay, we'll just.
It's same options, just renumbered. I thought option 1, the broader one, made sense to go with that
Okay,
first.
just make
So,
sure
yeah,
I
good
wasn't
question.
missing the look here. Okay.
Okay, but option 1 is for any 3-story mixed use, not detached.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So any existing NX, CX, OX, whatever, if someone wants to have a residential use there, then treat the transition the same way we would if it's RX. Only the 10-foot landscape yard, but you could have the building, the townhouses within that, what otherwise would be the 50-foot no-build area.
So I'm going to go back to the historic alley transition, the one that we have experience on the ground with, a negotiated outcome that everybody's seen. We haven't seen the results of yet, but we know that the neighbors worked long and hard to get something they thought would work there. Are those mixed-use lots, are they OX, RX, NX, what are they?
I think there's a mix. I think there's definitely some OX along Hillsborough.
And
And
the
I
reason
think there's
I
some
ask
NX as
is
well.
Whether they even got involved in a conversation about an NX type use or a CX type use. Do you know whether the historic alley transition ordinance limits it to OX and RX, or is it only, or is it more specific just to what's happening in the 50-foot previously no build that gets use limited?
Right, yeah, I believe it's more about just that transition itself. I was checking the zoning just to refresh my own memory on that. So, yeah, a lot of OX right there, a little bit of NX. So yeah, any of these, of course, even the OX could have some retail.
Yeah, but it seems like there are some use limitations on the kind of activity that can happen in that retail. So, for instance, I don't expect we would anticipate a bar, nightclub, tavern, or lounge being involved in the retail use that's attendant to OX. Does that sound about right?
OX?
Yeah, there's some ancillary retail that's allowed, but it wouldn't be that kind of retail. Is that right?
Maybe I can add some clarity. I was just looking at the ordinance. So are you asking about the uses that are permitted within the transition area?
Well, what I'm really globally trying to get around to is whether there's a logical way for us to specify the kinds of if we have non-office and non-residential uses involved in this detached frontage, how we can make sure that they're compatible with the, if you're eliminating the transition, you're trying to add some density, but, you know, obviously broken up the massiveness of it, but are we concerning ourselves with the kinds of uses that might not be compatible with being 10 feet away from a residential lot line?
Yeah, so I think the idea is that none of those non-residential uses would be permitted in that transition area, or potentially on that entire property. It could be that the rule is for the entire property.
Right.
It'd be
And so that-
restricted
okay, so
to
then that-
residential.
Yeah, but then that takes me back to the OX, and that there is some ancillary retail there, but I think it's tightly constrained, so we're not gonna see late night activities, right?
That's correct, and there are certain locational standards for these ancillary retail uses in OX and RX. That's right.
But obviously, the thing that neighbors would be concerned about is if there was a bar up on the street, and the bar parking was in the back. Because obviously there's a direct correlation between the kind of activities that happen in a bar and the kind of people who are coming and going from a parking lot.
I think you might have that, you would have that same condition potentially now
Okay,
in any of these areas that are zoned for those kind of uses.
but right now, again, back to the basic OX question, the ancillary retail does or does not allow late night uses?
I'd have to look to the code for consultation, but my recollection of the standard is you have to have what I'll call the base use in OX
Right.
before you can have the ancillary use. And the ancillary use is limited to a maximum square footage. It's got to be in a mixed-use building. So there are certain constraints that are placed in the OX zoning district. It goes even further in RX, where it's got to be located at the corner of two streets. So we can look to the code standards to see what applies in that situation, but my recollection is there are specific guardrails in place.
Yeah, it seems like it was like sort of personal and professional services or a
Right.
coffee shop, but that was kind of it.
And my recollection is also that there were limited hours of operation
Right, okay.
for
All
certain
right,
uses.
we can just verify, okay. Okay, that's good.
Ask a question.
Please.
Okay, option 3 is, we've been talking about option 3, I know, we've been talking about all of them for a long time. But option 3 was really the sort of the aesthetics. If it looks like a house, looks residential,
Right.
then it's more compatible. So what's the difference, I'm sorry, between 3 and 2? Because
Mhm.
2 says if it's revised to address scale.
So 2 is more just about the scale. 3 goes a little further, because we can regulate the appearance of non-residential buildings. So it goes a little further with the design standards. Could get into materials, could get into, again, things like roof pitch and architectural details. Basically, that would make it look even more like a house. So 2 is make it detached and make it reasonable scale. 3 is make it look more like a house.
Okay. Yep.
So, to add on to that, I think the historic alley transition has some use constraints in addition to design constraints, right? In other words, it has to be a residential use back there.
Right. It has to be residential use.
But
And it
that's a-
limits the height as well, so it includes
Yeah.
that element
That,
too.
when you're talking about like an extra set of buildings, right?
Well, that's their context, yes.
Okay, but this is just talking about if there's a building,
Yeah.
it's built, and, okay,
Yes, and it, to your point about architectural features, was always a big conversation under the old Part 10 code that we have these thoroughfare frontage lots that used to be residential, now they're converting to businesses, but in the old code, we actually had a standard that defined what residential character would look like, so that when those cases came in, I can't remember whether it was by condition or by code, that they, in that context, would almost always be ascribed to having those kind of roof pitch, materials, residential looking windows, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, we still see residential or rezoning cases that come in and include some of those elements in that kind of context. Say along Six Forks or Falls of Noose, let's say, where there's a desire, and the street itself is no longer as accommodating to a detached house. But for the new buildings with new uses, office uses, medical office uses, to still respect or reflect that residential character. So that's what this is getting at.
so then number 1 is any building in those districts, we would say, now you only have to go back 10 feet, no matter what it looks like.
Yeah, that's right. And so these are, they're actually, and it's kind of hidden by that little menu. Let me hide that. The menu bar at the bottom. So they actually apply a little bit differently. So option 1 is more about facilitating residential. And again, it would apply pretty broadly, a lot of zoning districts. Options 2 or 3 are more about, well, it could be residential or office in like an OX
Okay.
zoning district. So you actually, it would be possible to do option 1, and that would facilitate residential anywhere, and then could also do, say, an option 3, which would facilitate more
Yeah, I got it. Okay.
residentially appearing
Here in
office.
Okay.
So these are, yeah.
So not
Mix and match.
exclusive.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I vote for 1 and 3. Are we picking? What are we?
I think it
That
would
would
be
be a-
useful to get some examples or to talk to some people who have, who are faced with, potentially with this and get their feedback.
So that was the several outreach opportunities that
Yeah.
you heard about?
Yeah.
And you said there are a limited number of those out there on the ground now?
Limited number, right, where we have the condition of something with the detached
Okay.
frontage that's adjacent to residential. So where, if these changes were made, where they would go into effect now, yeah.
Yeah.
But,
And-
so it would be pretty reasonable to, say, send letters to that group, invite them to a meeting and discuss.
And of course, for me, the benefit of what Cameron Park did with their historic alley, I mean, the alley component is a beautiful thing to separate these kinds of uses, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's, if we could incentivize it, that would be great. Because, but it's still sort of the proof statement that neighbors didn't have to have a 50-foot no-bill to feel like some kind of development back there was better than no development back there. And so that's a great opportunity going forward. My only concern is that we make sure we get the transitional elements right, whether it be uses or appearances. And so for me, it would be helpful to see the ones that if we put a rule in place, they would apply immediately and we'd understand, outside of the Cameron Park example, which is unique because of the alley, what kind of new contextual relationship we'd be creating, and how that would work for everybody.
Right.
I have a question, if I can. So this is no reflection of your presentation. This is a reflection of my lack of knowledge. I feel like we're really in the weeds on this, and I'm not sure that I could leave this meeting and tell anybody what we're talking about right now. So I thought the goal was to encourage or provide more flexibility for more missing middle housing, and I'm wondering how this does that. And again, no reflection on your presentation. My starting point is not level set with yours. Sorry to take this time to ask for that, but I'm going to ask for that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's a great question.
Okay.
And
It may not be, and
it
that's
is
okay.
really possible to get deep down into the weeds
Yeah.
once we start talking about the zoning and the frontage. And so the basic answer is, I would say, that option one in particular is the one that would go the furthest, the quickest to incentivizing more housing production. And in a sense, in a way that already aligns with what the code does. So, we already have a general understanding that something in RX3 doesn't need a big transition because it's residential. So if a residential building, if a townhouse in RX3 is okay next to a residential zoning district, why would a townhouse in OX3 not be equally okay next to a residential district? So that step pretty quickly would make it easier. It would provide more physical space and probably incentivize some amount of missing middle, because that's what we're talking about almost by definition, 3-story max, townhouse or apartment housing type. So the other ones, they do get a little bit in the weeds because we're talking about office and residential at the same time, and the detached frontage has only been applied in a pretty limited way. So the way that could be used going forward is if we create a detached frontage that people feel like really ensures the transitions and the scale of the buildings are right, then maybe we could apply that in a broader sense by rezoning additional properties with that. It's a way of giving people, both on one hand, providing more housing opportunities, but also giving people some certainty that the appearance is going to be something that they're, and scale is going to be something that they're comfortable with. So that one would be less immediate because it would take, there's only a handful of properties where that would make much of a difference now. So it would take some rezoning, whether city initiated or whether it's an option out there that people can select, and maybe selecting that option makes it easier for someone to work with their neighbors and go through the zoning process, because they can say, well, look, here's all these things that are guaranteed. You don't have to take my word on it. This zoning district that I'm requesting, it ensures that there would be some neighborhood scale to it. But clearly, if it's starting to involve a rezoning process, that's a more time-consuming way that it starts to get applied to the city. So it would be adding one more tool, I guess, to the toolbox.
Okay. And so walking through those options again, if that's what we're choosing today.
Right.
So you're saying option one would more quickly get to missing, just provide more flexibility.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So my comment is, this committee has a tremendous, incredible track record of promoting missing middle housing types, and this is another one that I expect us to approve. Obviously, again, Cameron Park is sort of proof of concept that you don't have to have a 50 feet of nothing to be something that fits, putting a mixed-use parcel next to a residential one. And I can see us, obviously the easiest one for me is a residential option one, but I also can see us saying, well, we could add on some non-residential opportunities in that 50-foot no-build zone too. So I'd like to look at all of those as opportunities to put something that's better than nothing in the 50-foot no-build. And it really goes right back to the comment you made that's really not use-related, but make sure the scale and transition is right. And so then that leads me back to, let's look at these ones that we know, whatever we decide, they're easy examples because they're built on the ground and we can easily understand what the impacts would be there, the benefits. And then we can extrapolate from there how we might use this to incentivize other people to come in and ask for the detached frontage, whether it be residential or office use. So that would be my recommendation, is to bring back those outreach opportunity examples, and then we can have the conversation about making sure that the scale and the transition is right. So and then we can decide whether we want residential or a broader mix.
And we could include, come back, if we're talking about coming back to the committee, a couple examples, diagrams that would illustrate those options.
Sounds good.
Does that work?
Sounds good. Yep.
Yep.
All right. Anything else?
No.
All right. Thank you
All right.
so much. Stand adjourned.
Good.